Welcome to the reality show, day 173 of the war in Israel. Yesterday on this channel, we spoke about Francesca Albanese, the United Nations Special Rapporteur on the occupied Palestinian territories. She's one of those people who just her job title tells you everything you need to know about her. But if you need to know a little bit more, here is her in the press conference yesterday, where she was uh, telling the world about her latest report.
I find that there are reasonable grounds to believe that the threshold indicating the commission of the crime of genocide against Palestinians as a group in Gaza has been met. Specifically, Israel has committed 3 acts of genocide with the requisite intent: causing serious bodily or mental harm to members of the group, deliberately inflicting on the group conditions of life calculated to bring about its physical destruction in whole or in part, and imposing measures intended to prevent birth within the group. The genocide in Gaza is the most extreme stage of a long-standing settler colonial process of erasure of the native Palestinians. For over 76 years, this process has oppressed the Palestinians as a people in every way imaginable, crushing
All right.
their inalienable right to self.
Yeah. Okay. I think that's more than enough. So yeah, I like that she throws in there. It's a 76-year thing. So basically, the very existence of Israel is what she is against. But here are some other things that weren't mentioned this time around, and some. So this is from an article in PBS. In the Gaza Strip, 97% of fresh water is unsuitable for human consumption, and raw sewage pours into the Mediterranean Sea. Facilities for desalinating and treating water function on only a limited basis, as Israel controls the flow of fuel and supplies into the region. This is an article in PBS titled "Water Crisis May Make Gaza Strip Uninhabitable by 2020." This is an article from January 1st, 2019. There's another article which I can't find at the moment, but it is from Al Jazeera. Oh, there it is. Oh no, this is not the one. So yeah, Al Jazeera in 2015, September 2nd, 2015. The title is UN Gaza may be uninhabitable by 2020 on current trends. New report reveals impact of 2014 Israel war on Strip, which sent, quote, almost all of the population into destitution. Gaza, quote, will not be livable by 2020. This is a UN report. This is a headline from the BBC, August 27th, 2012. Now, there's more, but I picked out a few. Basically, the only thing missing from yesterday's speech by Francesca Albanese is saying that this will result in whatever catastrophe in 2020, because that seemed to be a theme in the previous decade, and now it's kind of difficult to say it's going to happen in 2020, but it is about to happen. It is always about to happen. That's kind of the UN line, and now we are hearing about Israel intentionally starving the Gaza population. So this intro has been long enough. I am joined by Morgan Carter, and for the first time on the reality show, by Michael Kaufman. So I will go to you first, Michael. Your initial thoughts on this, what we just heard, and the story in general of Israel starving the population in Gaza.
Well, I'm a physician by training, and it reminds me a little bit of when we're telling a person who's overweight and their blood pressure is a bit too high that you're going to die in the next year, and you've been telling them that for 10 years, and they're still percolating along, and obviously that's a difficult situation. But I think there's a much bigger problem here, and I think part of the problem is our narrative and our need to respond to each of these cuts. It's funny, she used the word inalienable rights, which I believe appears in the American Declaration of Independence and maybe in our Constitution, but that's a very American term. It's obviously not a term that is recognized by any terrorist group, certainly not by the governing body, the so-called governing body of Gaza, nor the Palestinian Authority. And frankly, I don't believe there's a single country in the Middle East that believes there are inalienable rights for any of its people. So, Razi, I don't want to detract from the specific conversation today, but I do think we all need to start to ask ourselves, why are we responding to the yeah buts? Why are we giving these arguments any water when the foundation for all of these arguments, as you said, is built on this assumption that somehow there was a catastrophe in 1948, 49, which of course was Nakba, and the Arabs call it catastrophe, and it was a UN vote, a United Nations vote, ironically, that established Israel and established the demarcation lines of Israel. And that led to this woman, who is a supposed real employee of the United Nations, giving this kind of a speech. It is the essence of hypocrisy, but it's worse, because her end goal, her clear end goal here is to support terrorism. And that is the only thing she's interested in. And as a woman, it's even more impossible to believe that she really would support that, because we know how Hamas treats women. We know how even the best Middle Eastern Arab states treat women. And it's far worse in Gaza, et cetera. So I do think part of our discussion should center around this need for Jewish people in particular and Israelis to always respond to the specific attack that day instead of good responses. I'll give you a quick example, and then I'll turn it over to Morgan. One thing we do very well about dealing with this notion of genocide, especially in 76 years, is every other genocide that's been demonstrated on the planet has led to a significant reduction in population of the target population. Every other one, except for one, the amazing Israeli genocide against Gaza, and that has led to a population that exploded from the original several hundred thousand so-called Palestinian refugees to well over 2-3 million. Never mind that the Arab populations in Israel that are citizens of Israel have grown substantially. But we do a very good job of saying, stop. The definition of genocide is you have to reduce the population, but this has exploded. And that kind of answer, I think we really need to move to, because we are just too busy encountering every little detail and sort of arguing about stuff that's really not the point.
Yeah, I will just say, because we brought this up in one of the episodes, I read out the definition of genocide, and I was told, I was actually told in the comments as well, no, this is, there's a different definition for whatever court. Yeah, terms are defined by people who are trying to put one over on you using their definition. So yeah, genocide can happen if with the population increasing, apparently, especially if it's Israel being accused of that genocide. Morgan.
I mean, certainly going to definitions, part of the story here is talking about UNRWA. And the whole way UNRWA, since its inception, has defined Palestinian refugees has had it baked into it an anti-Israel premise. The idea that someone like Edward Said, born in Jerusalem, I think in the 30s, who left or was expelled with his family, came to Britain and then settled in the United States, lived a free, prosperous life, came back to Gaza and the West Bank at various points to protest, but was in a safe place, like not under threat, and was still considered a refugee for the rest of his life. And so are his children who never lived there. There's something off about that. And that's how these definitions get used. And certainly the whole rhetorical framing, we saw that going on with the lady we just saw there, but also in the article we were looking at in The Guardian. Straight away, it's talking about Israel having a vendetta against UNRWA and that Israel's actions are callous. And again, I was speaking on the show the other day, you need to look at how people are framing things from the off, because almost more than the content of what they're saying, that's going to determine how you're receiving the message. And all of this is portraying Israel as an unnecessary, maliciously inclined aggressor, when actually looking at UNRWA, it has a very real reason to want to oppose UNRWA and what it's doing. We know what's been going on in the schools and how that's been indoctrinating children in a way to perpetuate the conflict. So people need to be paying attention to that. And the way people flip these definitions again, when we're talking about genocide, looking at Ilan Pape's book recently, when he's bringing up the idea of genocide, clearly the length of the conflict is something which comes up in his mind and troubles him. So he comes up with this idea that, oh, it's an incremental genocide. Every other genocide has been mechanized on mass scale. If we're looking at World War II, it's killing a huge number of people very, very quickly. It shocks people to some extent. The final solution was instigated in the final years of the war in a very compressed period of time. And how do you address that in the conflict? The period of time of the conflict since 1948? Well, you have to rationalize it so that now it's an incremental genocide, and even though the population is exploding, as you say, Michael. So yeah, people need to just look at how people are using these definitions and ideas, and do they actually make sense?
Yeah, Robert, who has been a member for 23 months, says Israel is apparently guilty of trying to win a war which they didn't start. Yes, times are tough in Gaza. Is there supposed to be a nice way to win? Well, no, but Israel is not supposed to be fighting. It should be laying down. That, I think, is the narrative that we're supposed to accept. Thank you, Catherine, for the super chat. So this current starvation, Israel is intentionally starving the population, I think fits very well into the Hamas playbook, which Hamas is running this war expertly. They knew exactly how it's going to go from day one. They knew they were going to attack. They knew Israel will get some sympathy in the first few days, and then their people in the West, one by one, will start pushing their narrative. And of course, we mentioned yesterday, Francesca Albanese was calling for a ceasefire on October 14th, an immediate and unconditional ceasefire. So basically, Hamas was done. Israel hadn't started yet, and she wanted a ceasefire because the Hamas position, as articulated by one of their spokesmen, was we will do October 7th style attacks again and again until Israel is annihilated. So military action by Israel is action that is meant to prevent it from happening again and again. This is not something that they want to see. And I'm going to read, I know I sent you guys an article, an op-ed by Kenneth Roth, who used to run Human Rights Watch. Before I get to that, there's another op-ed from The Guardian, and I'm going to read some of this because this is really how the useful idiots of the Islamist movement in the West are doing their thing. So this is from last Thursday. The title is, "We are about to witness in Gaza the most intense famine since the Second World War." And if you think that is some heavy rhetoric, wait till I read some of the article. So I'm just going to read the beginning. Gaza is already the most intense starvation catastrophe of recent decades. The death toll from hunger and disease may soon surpass the body count from bombs and bullets. The Famine Review Committee reported this week that Gaza is facing, quote, imminent famine. The integrated phase classification system set up 20 years ago provides the most authoritative assessments of humanitarian crises. Its figures for Gaza are the worst ever by any metric. It estimates that 677,000 people, or 32% of all Gazans, are in, quote, catastrophic conditions today, and a further 41% are in, quote, emergency conditions. It expects fully half of Gazans, more than 1 million people, to be in, quote, catastrophe or, quote, famine within weeks. Now, the information on which everything that comes out of Gaza is based is from the people who committed the atrocities on October 7th. They are the ones feeding all this data, including the data that says there are 2 million people in Gaza. I don't know that is correct. Certainly we've talked on this channel specifically about how Hamas fabricates their numbers, and we're going to talk about that more in the next few days, by the way, because the number is likely about, the number of deaths is likely about half of what they are saying, and I think tomorrow's TRS is about that. But yeah, the people in the West who are basically a part of this propaganda machine are doing their job. Hamas is doing their job, and we in the West, those who support Israel, not we on this channel, but everybody else, is very apologetically saying, no, it's not really true. Michael, your thoughts on that?
Well, the first question you got to ask is, And and Ayn Rand actually says it beautifully, and she's more succinct than most. So I'll just point out that the only time physical force is justified is when somebody uses physical force against you. Once their gloves come off, you're free to do whatever is necessary to completely neutralize them, and I mean neutralize. And I fully agree, and I don't understand anybody. I mean, I understand the useful idiots, but I don't understand people that have learned some history and understand conflicts and have actually dug a little bit deeper into the history of humankind. I don't understand people who think that it's okay for one group to attack another and the other group has to fight back proportionally. This notion of proportional response is some post-World War II baloney. And it's ridiculous. If you should fight to win, or you're going to be annihilated over time. And frankly, Israel has tried proportional responses for the last many decades and ended up with October 7th. So first of all, they took the gloves off first. There was a ceasefire on October 6th. There was, by the way, a deal with Saudi Arabia cooking between Israel and Saudi Arabia. Jordan continues to buy water from Israel, just by the way, while they're bad-mouthing them. And on October 7th, there was an atrocity which we now know was geared towards taking over Tel Aviv. I mean, let's be clear, that was the goal, and we have the documents. Israel has the documents to prove that. They attacked us first. We have the right, and I believe the legitimate, we need to annihilate Hamas. And if you happen to be part of the electorate, because Hamas was, quote, democratically elected, because all Middle Eastern countries have democratic elections, according to the great UN, then you need to suffer for your government, just as the people of Germany suffered for their government under Hitler, and just as the people of Japan suffered for their government under under the emperor, with kamikazes, which are, by the way, no different than suicide bombers. That's what they were. They were using guns. And we decided in America to take disproportionate action to annihilate Japan, and we had to annihilate 2 cities that stopped the war, and that's what it took. Last point, the notion that we should not go into Rafah when it's very clear that the hostages, whether they're dead or alive, are there, and it's very clear that the senior leadership is there, is an absurd notion. The idea that anyone could float a notion that you should stop the war now and have effectively a unilateral ceasefire, because Hamas has said they're not going to return the hostages and they're not going to surrender. There is one other option here besides Israel going in there and knocking out Rafah. Hamas could surrender. They could give up the hostages. The senior leadership could turn themselves in. Somehow the world has forgotten that. And by the way, we, who are the people that have some insight, have forgotten to remind the world that Hamas can end this war tomorrow. Surrender, return the hostages, war is over. Israel is done.
Morgan. You're muted.
Sorry, I was muted. I certainly agree that a lot of this idea of proportionality is what's influencing the international opinion, and the way in which just war theory has totally, I think, reoriented people's attitude towards war. As you say, Michael, it's almost a historical way of understanding what war is and what war has been. And so if you're looking at some of the outcry, particularly if you're looking at on Twitter, the way they're framing their objection is that this war is so terrible. And so they'll post pictures of children who have been killed and so on and all this kind of stuff. And they'll say, don't look away. And yet actually what's underlying some of their premise is that war doesn't have to be this terrible. They're saying this war is really terrible, but the war could be done nicer. And when we're looking at famine setting in, I was just, on the previous show with Joseph, and we were talking about Japan and the way in which part of the total defeat of Japan and bringing about its total conversion as a society so that the conflict with Japan isn't still ongoing. There aren't, as you say, there aren't kamikaze pilots flying into the United States, was not just the total military defeat, in a sense, the display of ostentation from the American military showing strength, power, forthrightness, but it was also that they didn't go in with aid trucks and deliver them to the population before there was total surrender. And this will be shocking to the people who are on the line that Israel's not doing enough and not letting enough aid trucks in. Letting in one is too much. That's way too much. And if the US had been doing that, had been, keeping the population going, it might have looked very different in Japan. But once there was total surrender, then they came in and they delivered aid and they reconstructed that society. And maybe that's something that could happen with Gaza. I don't know. And, in a sense, I'm not very optimistic. But if the aid is going in beforehand, what Israel's doing is completely allowing its destroyers to continue on. And, that very much goes to Rand's idea of the sanction of the victim, which, if people aren't familiar with, they should just give a quick Google after the show, because that's a lot of what we see going on here. So yeah, there we go.
Yeah, I won't reread this tweet of mine that I have often read on this show from October 8th, but just to remind people in general, it was saying Israel needs to act now because it can act decisively. Otherwise, the international community will demand that it not act. And I said in that tweet, I think Netanyahu knows this, and this is why he's not acting, because he doesn't want to do what's right. And when we're hearing now about the starving the population and so on, there's two problems there: a problem of fact and a problem of value. Factually, this is incorrect. This is not being done. The opposite is being done. In an unprecedented way, Israel is attempting to help the civilian population of its enemy. There's also the major problem of values, which is in a war, you should cause suffering to your enemy. And here's the thing, the Palestinian people were not suffering at all. They were out in the streets celebrating on October 7th. On October 7th, they heard, that the fence has been breached. Many of them, thousands of them, marched through to participate in the atrocities. Many others were out in the streets celebrating. Nobody did anything to attempt to prevent the response by Israel. Hundreds of hostages were held, in many cases by families. People knew where they were. This was not a difficult thing. We've said this before. There's internal disagreements among the Palestinians. Some want an Islamic totalitarian regime, some want an Arab fascist regime, some want a communist dictatorship. But the one thing they're all united on is they want to exterminate the Jews and kick them out of Israel. So yeah, what happened? The reason Germany and Japan are now civilized countries is because there was the military response was such that made them suffer enough to realize that doing this is never an option for them ever again. The Palestinians, in response to October 7th, are getting aid, they're getting the world's support, and they're getting Israel itself forgetting what happened on October 7th. Look, in the immediate days after October 7th, Israel said there will not be any aid until all the hostages are released. There was a statement that Israel told Egypt, if you send fuel trucks to Gaza, we will bomb them. That is the right policy. Where did that go? That rhetoric, the fact that rhetoric was there then, and then Israel is doing the exact opposite, tells the world that Israel is a paper tiger, tells future terrorists, future attacks may cause some inconvenience to you for a while, but ultimately it is a benefit. You will gain from it, because that is what Israel's current policies are saying, and that is what the international response is saying. Michael.
Yeah, I think this is part of more of a, frankly, Obama-Biden policy in the world, and I don't want to jump off the Israel too much, but I think the U.S. is in the Western world's response to the situation in the Red Sea and the Houthis is really the same kind of thing. Where why are the Houthis a problem? They're not any kind of military strength. They're from one of the poorest countries in the world. They could have been annihilated immediately. That we could have gone in there and the NATO, the U.S. alone could have gone in there and taken out all the Houthis, and that would be the end of it. That's what should have been the end of it. But we, the Western world, since, frankly, Obama, as best as I can tell, believe that somehow appeasing Iran and all of its surrogates is a good thing to do. And someday someone's going to wake up somewhere in the Iranian axis and decide that terrorism is not worth it. And the fact that a bunch of essentially insects are taking out our shipping lanes in one of the most important parts of the world is just the same exact thing. Israel has absolutely made a big mistake on the aid. The fact that the Hamas leadership is willing to let more of their people die than most countries would before surrendering is not a reason to provide aid. The other person being worse is not a reason for you to be better. What you have to do is respond to their behavior in an equivalent way. If they're going to be worse and they're going to let their population suffer, and if their people are going to starve to death, the people that elected them are going to starve to death, and they're not going to surrender, then those people have to starve to death. None of this would have happened if October 7th hadn't happened. My last point, there's a law in America that has to do with when you commit a crime, if someone is killed during the crime, it's called the felony murder rule. And the idea is if you initiated a crime, even if you're not the one that ended up murdering the person, you are responsible for that death. Because if you hadn't done it, if you hadn't instigated the crime, the person wouldn't be dead. That's what's going on. I mean, it's amazing that we are allowing the Hamas leadership more leeway. And by the way, they're getting plenty of the aid, and they're stealing most of the aid. So we really are enabling them. But it's remarkable that we have our own laws here, and somehow the quote innocent Palestinians who elected this government deserve foreign aid and so on. It's absurd.
So just quickly, Morgan, before there was a point there that you made, Michael, that I disagree with. You said Hamas leadership is willing to let more of their people die. Hamas leadership wants more of their people to die.
Yes, fair enough.
And it plays perfectly. By the way, this is why they pretend that more people die than actually die, and of course blow up the number of children and women. You would think that Gaza is a place where everybody's a child or a woman, according to the statistics. But there was this article in Ma'ariv, the Israeli newspaper news site, about so last week a few senior officials in the Hamas emergency committee in Rafah were killed by the IDF, and there are reports since then that prices in the markets in Rafah are all of a sudden 50% lower than they were before. Hamas is any starvation that is happening in Gaza is happening because Hamas wants the people to starve. Because again, look at the reaction in the world. The reaction in the world is to increase pressure on Israel whenever there are such reports. Every such report is a reason for the Western leaders to increase their pressure on Israel. And again, this is pressure that results ultimately in the failure of Israel's war, Israel achieving its targets in this war, and ultimately in the long run will result in the death of Israelis. This is what this means when we buy into this narrative. So,
Razi, I know I'm not. Just to give you a quick response to that. I do agree with you, of course, and you're absolutely right. But I think a good bit of the problem is that we answer that charge with a defense instead of with an offense. And the offense is exactly what we've been saying here. We were attacked. Take people back to it. We were attacked. We are going to annihilate Hamas, and we are not going to stop until all the hostages are returned and Hamas either surrenders or is dead. And stop with the defense of the particulars, because we're stuck with these silly arguments when we forgot about the foundation.
Morgan.
I mean, just to focus on people in the West as well. Part of the reason why we're focusing on Israel so much on the channel is because of the wide implications that the war will have, but not just for Israel and the region there, but for people in the West as well. And the way the reaction has been, I don't think people are thinking about this long term and really thinking about the long-term implications of their actions. Maybe they can't see it because of the framework which they're using. But in undermining Israel, in its right to defense here when it so clearly has justification in doing it and in second guessing everything and in saying it needs to support its own enemies and its own destroyers who've kidnapped its own people and murdered and violated them in such vile ways. What are we going to do when we have to go fight a war next? Now, we're already seeing some of this with the Houthis. There wasn't as much as an outcry, but there were key people in the journalistic space, in the intellectual space, who were saying, no, the Houthis are justified here. They're fighting in support of the Palestinians. We saw that coming from Finkelstein, where he said he absolutely supports the Houthis. He'll rely on international law at other times, but he's all in favor of the Houthis. So when it's expedient, they really will do that. And let's say Western countries, the UK, US, whoever, are attacked in a really big way that's going to really will require military response. How are we going to do that in a way that serves our own interests once we spent the whole time undermining Israel? Maybe we'll be complete hypocrites, in which case Israel, the disgust I imagine is going to be felt is going to be on a scale that's unbelievable, and it'd be completely justified against us because we will have completely betrayed an ally in doing what's right for them to be doing. But I fully expect that we won't fight forthrightly. Even looking at some of the recent conflicts that the West has been involved in the Middle East, looking at the instructions which soldiers were under, the requirements which were put on them, the limitation on weaponry they were able to use, tactics which were able to be used. There was already some of this going on and creeping in, and I think we should only expect it to be getting worse. And this is really going to come back on us in a big way.
Yeah. Thank you, Catherine. Thank you, Kathleen. Thank you, Apollo Zeus. And thank you, Kathleen, again for the super chats. Morgan, we don't have to try to predict it. 9/11 happened, and America already fought like that, and starting from picking the target that was both easiest to fight against and easiest to get a coalition around fighting against. Started that war. The first thing that was dropped on Afghanistan was food and medicine, and 20 years later, the people who were in charge of Afghanistan on 9/11 were back in charge. This is what happens when you fight like this. And we've seen this, and we've seen something else that we talked about last week. I think we missed something, Morgan, last week when we did the episode. Why do self-hating Jews hate Jews? Because one self-hating Jew who we didn't mention was Kenneth Roth. He's of Jewish descent, right? He used to run what's it called? Human Rights Watch, which we've spoken about on this channel before, heavily funded by Qatar, as is Hamas, as is Al Jazeera, the network where people go to for their news when they're, they want to see why the Palestinians are right in their war. So he wrote an op-ed in The Guardian 2 days ago titled, "Israel's attempt to destroy UNRWA is part of its starvation strategy in Gaza." I mean, the title of this op-ed alone is full of so much. Again, it's one of those things that where you kind of know who the person is just from that title. But it continues, this attack could not come at a worse time for Palestinians. Hunger is widespread in Gaza, and famine is projected in the north by May. It didn't say if it's May 2020, but I would guess it is. And yeah, so in this headline, he first of all says that it is Israel's starvation strategy. Israel again letting aid from all directions into Gaza, going out of its way to protecting with its tanks the aid convoys because Palestinians are attacking aid trucks and killing drivers of those trucks. But also his defense of UNRWA is interesting. What is the issue with UNRWA? The issue with UNRWA is that UNRWA not only had its own people participate in the October 7th attack and others celebrate the October 7th attack, but it runs the schools where the attackers had been educated. UNRWA has a history, its entire history is a history of bringing the Palestinian people, bringing Palestinian culture to where it is today, to where October 7th happened, and the people are completely united against it. And this is what the former chairman, or whatever the title of his job was at Human Rights Watch, this is what he thinks we should focus on. And again, Michael, like you said, our response, or not our response, but Israel's response is usually, no, actually, it's not like that. And here, look at all these numbers of trucks and so on.
Yeah, the fact that we're even having a discussion where UNRWA gets a vote, it is absurd. At this point, UNRWA is completely emasculated. They are completely corrupt. It's very clear that they need to go away. And instead of repeating that, and I agree, the American leadership is asleep at the wheel, or is, from my opinion, morally bankrupt, mainly because they're trying to appease a crazy radical leftist organization that clapped for 9/11. For sure. I mean, these people hate America, and they're very glad to see any Western democracy harmed. They don't believe in life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness. And they somehow believe that this vision of the world, which is led by Hamas and Hezbollah and Iran and everything, is good. UNRWA, and all the way down from the Secretary General of the United Nations down to UNRWA, are completely anti-Semitic, corrupt, disgraceful people. And yet we continue to bring them into the narrative. And there's nothing constructive they can give. This woman is exactly what is the problem. The woman who you were quoting at the beginning, she's the problem. You're saying that the entity that you work for, who pays your salary, who stands for United Nations, which voted on Israel, really started this catastrophe. You're not allowed at the table anymore. And we have not done a good job in the West of saying, not everybody does get a vote. And I think we need to start to say that. If you and we disagree on fundamentals like life, liberty, pursuit of happiness, and fundamental rights, the use of the word inalienable rights in her speech was classic, then you don't get a speech at the table. You don't get a seat at the table. We need to start to say that. We can't be so mushy on the West, because they are nuts on the other side. And frankly, we used to be much more sure of our values here in the West. And our values are what led this world to be as good as it is. All of the technology that these terrorists are using against us, all of it, was invented in the West. And we just continue to support it. I think it's completely crazy. The last point, and just to go back to your comment on numbers, this famine baloney, first of all, it's absurd, because there was another 26 tons of aid that were dropped in today by Spain. I mean, it has to be absurd, because, like you said, these are the same people that measured the 500 bodies that were killed in the hospital attack, and we debunked that, and yet we still keep playing this. There's also a minority of pictures of people in Gaza eating very well, with vendors, vendors having a lot of food, relatively a lot of food at their disposal. And like you said, prices dropped in Rafah. So people have to start to think, and they have to start to say, does this make sense? Does A to B to C line up? Does 1 + 1 = 2 here? Or is what I'm hearing inconsistent with each other? And that's what we have. And the West has got to start to stand up and be definitive.
Yeah, but going back to the point where we have both our facts and our values wrong. Yeah, they have plenty of food, and they shouldn't. That's on one point. And yeah, the fact that Israel isn't standing up for itself, and its allies aren't standing up for Israel and for the West. And yeah, you don't get a seat at the table is what the U.S. should say to the UN. And also, we're taking back the table because we're paying for this table. It's right there in prime Manhattan real estate. Get out, go to one of those countries that truly represent those values. And the 25% of the UN's budget that comes from the US, you have to deal without it. That would be a nice move from the US. I don't expect it anytime soon, but I'm pretty sure Biden is a regular viewer of this show, so maybe we have convinced him. Let's see. Morgan.
You were saying about Israel not standing up for itself. And unfortunately, we're talking about the West here in opposition to Israel, but there's a lot of ways in which we speak about Israel as being a representative of Western values, and unfortunately, that comes with the package dealing and the mixed aspects as well. And we recently saw the suspension of Aylon Levy, who was one of the leading English language spokespeople in the UK, and it was confirmed the other day that after his suspension for about a week, he was fired, and they made their official statement on it. And basically, it was because he was causing too much trouble. He was being a bit too in your face about it. And in the final straw that broke the camel's back, as they put it, was him responding to a tweet by David Cameron saying, "Look, the Israelis are stopping all these aid trucks going in," and he responded to it saying, "No, we're not. We're not stopping them going in." In effect, saying, "No, we want to do that. We want to let all this aid go in. Like, we're not the bad people here." And as much as we spoke up in favor of Aylon Levy, and there are good things about him, unfortunately, in Israel's communications response defense, too much of the premise has been conceded already. And when he got fired for defending Israel in that way, but that defense is coming from the completely wrong orientation. Really what it should have been, and he definitely, I guess, would have got fired for this, is damn straight we're stopping them. Of course we are. We're not going to allow this. And yet we haven't seen that. And, there are better aspects of Israel's defense of itself, but unfortunately, so long as you're ceding that ground in effect, then your opponents are going to have a real upper hand on you.
Yeah, and I said on that episode that we did about Aylon Levy, and I think I was right, that he should have been fired because he's a spokesperson. As a spokesperson, you need to toe the line. That's a part of your job. And he was too pro-Israel. He actually thought Israel was in the right, and the Israeli government disagrees with that. So he should, he didn't fit the job description. Should I read some of this op-ed? And thank you, Gail, for the super chat, and thank you, Lee, for the super chat. Let me read a little bit because the way it's often the way these things are phrased and the way they're formulated not only shows the mind and what the person writing thinks, but also what they think of their audience. And as I said yesterday with Al Jazeera, I think they're right in what they think of their audience. So he says, Israel's vendetta against the United Nations Relief and Works Agency for Palestine Refugees in the Near East, UNRWA, illustrates the callousness with which Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right government has fought the war in Gaza. It also reflects an effort to use Hamas's October 7th attack as an opportunity for demographic re-engineering. So, the show we did yesterday about the Al Jazeera documentary, I mentioned that I had previously seen Owen Jones's interview with the director of it, and a point that they were making in that interview was how important it is to point out that all these things that Israel said happened didn't actually happen. The modern day Holocaust denial, as we call it on this channel, because that is the justification for Israel retaliating. No, that is not the justification. The very fact that the attack happened is a justification, and the details matter much less. Now, of course, on this channel, if you scroll back, if you search Israel on this channel and scroll back before October 7th, you will see some of us advocating for military action preemptively in Gaza. But imagine what the reaction would have been to that. So, yeah, Michael, your thoughts on that?
Yeah, again, I think you have to go back to first principles, and while it may not be the everyday person's job to think a little bit longer term, a little bit, you do have to understand that the movement of civilizations is based on philosophy. That's how we get to where we are. The philosophy that got us to where we are was, frankly, a bunch of old white, middle-aged white men, mostly, writing down Western philosophical thought from, John Locke and Descartes and so on, all the way up to John Stuart Mill, and I'm not a philosopher, so I don't know all of them, and basically putting together what ended up in the Declaration of Independence, which, by the way, transformed much of Western Europe. It wasn't the other way around. We reacted to what we perceived as the United Kingdom's British dominance and unfairness, and we came up with life, liberty, and the pursuit of happiness, and those general ideas that liberty mattered, which is the foundation of American thought. It used to be anyway. Is what led to the economic booms and capitalism and so forth, and the wealth of nations that has been created. It's really simple. It's very difficult to talk to young people because they didn't learn this stuff, and also because they were never taught that where did all this good stuff come from? They seem to think it was just here, and our job is to use it. Well, it took a lot of work to get here. And the reason for going back that far is because, as you said earlier, if you don't start with a philosophy, you can't work on justifying your current position and where you want to get to. When I talk to people that I disagree with, I usually say, what's your end game? So ask people what Hamas's end game is. What is the beauty of Hamas? What are they going to do? It's either going to be an Islamic totalitarianistic or a communistic totalitarianistic. But one thing's for sure is it ain't going to be liberty. Same thing with Iran, same thing with Russia, same thing with China, same thing with the anti-Western parts of the world. How the West can continue to pretend that these other philosophies, which would shoot you for having any disagreement with them, is an acceptable goal in the ascent of humanity is beyond me. So Al Jazeera, of course, is going to come up with this crap because they've got audiences who are going to listen to it. But I think we need to start to say to people, what's the end game here? What's the goal? Israel's end game is Netanyahu's right-wing crazy government, which, by the way, I have protested personally and nearly got whacked by a couple of police officers there while I was in the middle of the highway through Tel Aviv, is horrendous, for sure. But they're nothing compared to what goes on in these totalitarian Middle Eastern Islamic crazy governments, okay? You have to ask, where is this all going? And most young people that I get into a discussion with say, well, I don't know. Don't they just want the same things we want for their people? It's like going into a lion's cage, having a discussion with the lion, and everything is going great until the lion realizes he's hungry, and then he just eats you. These are not the same philosophies that we have. These are not similar to us, except for they are completely diametrically opposed. They not only want to annihilate us, but they have a different vision of the future of humanity, and most of it ends up with us in the dark ages.
Thank you, Kirsten, for the super chat. Morgan.
I mean, just off the back of what you said, Michael, in terms of talking to people in the West about where they think this is going, I would also maybe ask them, who do you think Hamas are? Like, what do you think their goals are? What do you think they want to achieve for their own people, let's say? Because, sometimes you get people who will say something really ludicrous. Like when we were talking about ISIS on the show the other day, and, I drew a comparison between them. Someone said, oh yeah, Hamas and ISIS, they're not even similar. Okay. What Hamas wants is they're one of the worst representatives of the style of politics, let's say, or the style of structuring a society that exists in the region. They want to mirror the worst elements. They do not want freedom, human rights, the rule of law. And what's so awful about the way people in the West are reacting is that they're in favor of Gaza staying as it is. What they don't want is a ceasefire so that somehow some reconstruction efforts can come in and construct this wonderful utopia that's going to outstrip Israel. What they're in favor of is it staying a miserable dictatorship under Hamas's rule and oppressing those people. Now, some of those people or an awful lot of those people are in favor of that, but that still doesn't go to that. That's not in their own interest, whether they recognize it or not. And that's what people are in favor of and what they're supporting. And what I want to, do is grab them and shake them and say, how can you do that? How can you be in favor of that or think that's okay? And I think there's a deep confusion. I think there's a deep malice with some people, but very often there's just been a deep confusion in the philosophy they've accepted and their attitude towards war, and then their attitude towards Israel, because there's a special way in which Israel's treated. Very different standards to the rest of the world.
Yeah, so in the paragraph I read from this op-ed. There's the what did he say? The illustrates the callousness with which Benjamin Netanyahu's far-right government has fought the war in Gaza. By the way, it'd be interesting to for somebody to research this. I'm not going to do it, but if somebody wants to, how many times in The Guardian does right or right wing appear compared to far right? I think it's I think it's everybody's far right. But this channel has also I got in trouble with some people on the channel when I think it was like a week or a few days into the war where we had an episode titled Netanyahu Must Go, and I was told yes, but this is not the time to talk about it. And I thought, well, no, I mean the time was also before, but also now. But Netanyahu has among the things he's gotten in trouble for was accepting gifts that he should not have accepted, considering his position. And I think now might be a good time for Netanyahu to regift some of those to Chuck Schumer and President Biden, because Netanyahu politically was done. And the intervention in Israeli politics done by the U.S. in recent weeks, which again they don't do to dictators who are considered American allies, but they do to a country that did elect this government. You don't like it, you wait till the next election. Is just unbelievable, and has done wonders in reviving what should have been a completely dead political career. Michael, you spend a lot of your time in Israel. Your thoughts on that?
Yeah, just for clarity, so I'm in Miami right now. I'll be heading back to Tel Aviv in a couple days. I spent half my time in Tel Aviv, as I mentioned, including a lot of the protests against the government. Um, it is remarkable what has happened in this country. I mean, even Alan Dershowitz, who's a lifelong Democrat and one of the great lawyers in America, and I rarely see eye to eye. He's a very smart man, but he's saying he can't vote Democrat, or he probably won't vote Democrat for the first time in 60 years because of what has gone on. You don't hear Biden talking about the Ayatollah, who has violated every nuclear agreement he has ever had. He's suppressed his people. He's murdered far more people than ever will be dead from a war, a legitimate war in Gaza. He suppressed women. He kills routinely. They stone and drop gay and lesbian people from buildings, all well documented, and they're very proud of it in that society. And you never heard Biden complain about that. You don't hear much even with Biden against Putin, as much as we're supporting Ukraine and so on, which is also a problematic thing. And of course, we never had a problem here with what went on in Sudan and what continues to go on in Sudan. And this famine that was supposed to be the worst famine ever, for those people who don't know anything about a guy called Joseph Stalin, might want to read about the famines in Russia, and might want to read a little bit about what happened in Ethiopia, and it continues to go on in several African nations with famine. Again, the useful idiots here, the lack of education, and I do put it up, the blame to our system in America, is being worked on every angle it possibly can. At the same time, Netanyahu rarely comes out with anything that's a reasonable response. The most responsible thing I think he said recently was to the U.S., we are going into Rafah. You don't get to determine. We are going to win this war. Now, we all know he's prolonging the war for his own political reasons, which is ridiculous because time is against Israel in general. But part of the problem is that Israel has accepted kind of this ongoing criticism instead of going back and saying, wait a minute, we are going to win this war. Hamas needs to be eliminated and the hostages need to come back. Full stop. That's it. Until those two goals are achieved, we are going to continue to pound Gaza. And I agree with you gentlemen completely. The idea of sending an aid, at least half of which is going to the terrorists, is really appalling. It is unbelievable, and really could only be organized against Israel the way it has.
Yeah, and by the way, Netanyahu would be a great leader if his actions matched his rhetoric and the content of his books.
Yes. Yes.
Morgan.
Agreed.
I don't have enough detailed knowledge on Netanyahu per se, but certainly I think that once the war has finished, the Israelis, if what could happen in Israel that would be terrible, and I'd get your impression as to whether this is likely, would be for people, if he sees the war through, to say, you saved us, we're going to keep you here. I think once the war's done, he has to go. Now, maybe that's not even very likely, but just that. And on the aid, the figure I saw floating around was that about 60% is being taken by Hamas. I don't know how solid that is. I don't know how you really measure it. But whatever the actual figure is, the thing that I think people can be pretty certain on is that Hamas is prioritizing themselves getting the aid first so that they can continue their fight, the fuel, the food, clothing, whatever. And then it's going to the population. So even the idea that this is just a nice, warm, fuzzy, bleeding heart humanitarian kind of thing, that doesn't even hold water. So again, people need to get serious and rethink this thing.
Well, some people who are serious are the ANC, the ruling party in South Africa. They're not serious about fixing South Africa from being a failed state, but they are serious about hating Israel and hating Jews. And we're going to talk about them tomorrow on the Daily Objective with Chris Hadding, who's back on the channel, the executive director of the Center for Risk Analysis in South Africa. And then on the reality show, I believe we are talking about we're going into the details of how Hamas fabricates the numbers. This is new content, not a repeat of the one we did a few weeks ago. Michael, where can people find more from you?
Best is my last name, Kaufman, Kauffman. Look up, I'm on LinkedIn. If they want to email me, they can probably best to do it through LinkedIn first and I'll respond. I check it basically daily so I can give an astute, erudite comment to a lot of the postings there.
And Morgan, where can people find you?
You can find my Twitter in the description, which will be the best place to follow me and find me at the moment. My Substack's being revamped, which will go live, probably in the next few weeks because I'm really busy. But if you subscribe, when that goes up, you'll get that new content coming through to you.
I'm at Razi Ginzberg on X, and we will be back here tomorrow with the Daily Objective and the reality show. Thanks, guys, for joining me. Thanks, everybody, for watching. If you think this content is valuable, like it, comment, and share it so that more people get to see it. And we'll see you all back here tomorrow.